Ballerina Girl, Part 1 of a work-in-progress novel, a restoration comedy by John Freed. Simone Weil wrote, "The greatest calamity the human race can experience is the destruction of a city." Plaster, rocks, and dust exploded in Adrian's face like a shotgun blast as he hit the wall with his 3-pound sledge. A moment before, he was standing in the remains of a 1950s-style salmon-colored bathroom in an 1880s Pittsburgh row house. A white rectangular medicine cabinet levitated between the bare studs of the partially demolished wall. It would bring a few extra bucks at Warhola's scrapyard, he thought, right before he went blind. He wasn't wearing goggles. He hated goggles. Besides, it seemed much more prudent to actually see what you were aiming at. He was lucky that the ricochet of the sledge hadn't killed him. However, at this moment, he was incapable of appreciating his good fortune. His eyes stung. He felt like a fool, a blind one. Rubbing his eyes with the backs of his hands, he sat down deliberately to keep from falling down. His rear end just caught the rounded slope of the permanently stained salmon-pink toilet that was lying on its side. Once more, he was lucky in that way that the unskilled are lucky. A few inches either way, and he could have broken his tailbone. He went about the task of arduously removing the bits of plaster from his eyes with the flipped underside of the front of his sweatshirt. When he had finished, Adrian appreciated for the first time how the last sunlight that slanted through the broken-out windows tinted his world a dusty rose. Like a fighter after a knockdown, Adrian shook his head and pushed himself back up again. He decided that since he was all alone, it might be safer if he instead did some shoveling. He wore a face mask that was held on with a rubber band that snagged his tightly curled hair whenever he moved. The paper mask itself was a joke. It seemed only to serve the purpose of effectively injecting equal amounts of plaster and coal particles into his nasal passages and lungs with every breath. The shovel made a grating sound as he scraped it across the floor. He spilled its contents loosely in the direction of the open garbage bag. That rosy gauze curtain rose again. His coffee-colored skin was blackenized. His tight curls were soaked with perspiration. Adrian felt near exhaustion. He jumped a little when he caught his own reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. How had this strange coal-black man snuck up on him? His reflexes defensively brought up the shovel to his chest. Smiling, his teeth gleamed extra white in the mirror. 3 fingers ran slowly down, first his right, then left cheek, creating lighter bars of war paint. Ugh. From somewhere in the distance, he could just make out the incessant 8-bar clang of "Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head." The tinny sound came closer. He hated that song. Adrian glanced out the window. The Good Humor truck was making its last roundup of the neighborhood for the day. Kids chased after it like dogs, and of course there were real dogs too. 3 scroungy mutts and a runaway poodle ran with the kids to form a pack around the little truck. The kids were paralyzed by all the choices. Sad to say, it never failed that one of them would be shortchanged and forced to watch in despair his friend's delight. Afterwards, the fortunate ones flicked the wooden sticks onto the sidewalk for the dogs. Adrian stuck his head out the window. The rising evening breeze felt good. He turned his head to look in the opposite direction. Waddling after an old black man who was pushing a shopping cart full of cans and almost new car batteries was a mangy duck. Its rumpled feathers poked out every which way as the duck passed. A kid tossed an ice cream stick its way. Immediately, the duck clasped its bill around an end at exactly the same time as a dog. There was a moment when everyone's attention focused on the 2 animals. Even from his elevated vantage point, Adrian held his breath. However, the dog had apparently encountered the duck before and conceded the prize. Sometime later, Adrian would hear that the duck had been killed fighting over a chicken bone. Relaxed and calmer, Adrian noted the much smaller number of black kids, and they were all black, brought out by the Pied Piper truck than on his own street just 6 blocks away. No doubt the white people were taking over from behind their refinished Victorian doors. He had a number of theories about white people. For example, he was convinced that all their freezers were as chock full of treats as any good-humored truck. This particular theory was actually based on personal experience. He had attended a birthday party almost 5 years earlier at Josh Levin's house. Josh's mother, who considered herself to be quite the progressive, had led the whole gang of kids, about half white and half black, to the garage behind their house. There stood an avocado-colored box shaped like an enormous coffin. She opened it and instructed each child to stand up on a specially constructed step stool to fish for his own treat. Mrs. Levin grinned stiffly. "Let Josh's new friends go first." The other black kids stepped forward as one, Adrian holding back. He'd never seen so many frozen treats in his life, including the freezer at Moe's Grab and Go on the corner. There were orange push-ups, 2 flavors of bomb pops, Nutty Buddies, Cherry Bar, you name it, the Levins had it. Even though Mrs. Levin had said that the kids could have all they wanted, Adrian had snuck back and taken a few more after they went back to the party in the house. Of course, on his way home, they had melted, and he had been appropriately punished for ruining his new jacket. He was certain that 11 had seen him because he was never invited back. What he didn't know was that none of Josh's new friends had been asked to return. The Levin's noble experiment had been terminated after some of Josh's favorite toys had turned up missing. Shortly thereafter, Josh himself departed from the neighborhood elementary school in favor of a private one in Squirrel Hill. Mrs. Levin told her friends, "Well, they're only young once. You just can't sacrifice their education to your beliefs." After that, when Adrian and Josh would pass each other on the street, each gave the other the courtesy of averting his eyes. Now, at 15, Adrian had the body of a man and the respect of working for his uncle's demolition company, but a large part of him still wanted to be down there with the kids, the dogs, and the duck. Hell, it was almost 8:30 a Saturday night, and he was left alone with a broken snow shovel and a dozen boxes of heavy-duty garbage bags to put the debris in. Some fun. The bags were a pain in the ass. He had ripped through the first few until he discovered the physics that weight could substitute for volume, and he could double and triple the bags if necessary. Easier said than done when a snow shovel was part of the equation. Normally, the crew would just have thrown together a wooden chute, stuck it out the window into the bed of a dumpster, and let it all fly, and fly it would, into people's living room windows, opened wide for the summer, dinking car tops, trunks, and hoods, releasing voluminous clouds of dust until someone would yell, "Hey, cut that shit out!" Then they'd have to be more careful. But this was no ordinary ghetto job. This was the historic district. Frankly, Adrian could see very little difference between these houses and those of his own on the other side of Brighton. In fact, some on his streets were far more impressive with their stone fronts and curved-topped windows. Now, of course, what was different was that if this were in his part of the neighborhood, this rat catcher of a house would have been torn down and a lot left vacant for weeds and discarded hypodermic needles. What he missed most was the total demolition of frame houses like this. It made him feel like the God of the Old Testament exercising his wrath. He took special pride, moving like a demon tightrope walker on the ceiling joists and roof, blithely frisbeeing the peelings of roof shingles toward the dumpster below. Afterwards, he would gather all the reusable lumber, the doors and hardware, onto the alley side of the lot for the truck, and wait eagerly for the bulldozer to finish flattening the job. Jobs like the one he was on, however, were particularly tedious. It was weird to carefully separate the lath from the loose plaster, then bale the lath together like firewood and shovel the debris into expensive trash bags, then carry each one of them down the stairs and out the door as if he were moving somewhere and needed to take it all with him. But this was what white people apparently had to have done before they could start their restorations. It certainly didn't help any that the old gray toad next door insisted on sitting on his front stoop all day long, crabbing at them from 7 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, when they usually called it a day to get to the dump before it closed. The old guy would hack and cough as he listened to Pirates games, clear plastic tubes shoved up his nose from an oxygen tank, breaking only to call the cops every time a bag split open. He even made them pay him money to use his hose to water the truck down while it was being loaded. "You people all want something for nothing," he'd mutter, not out of earshot. "Well, not when it's my water, no siree." He'd repeat at least 10 times a day. This old man was the reason Adrian was working so late on a Saturday night. The crew had to be out of here by Wednesday, or the general contractor threatened he couldn't pay them because they'd all be in violation of some special permit, and this city'd put the whole job into some sort of limbo land like others on the street. Adrian tried to make the best of the situation. In fact, he considered it a luxury that the cousins had left him alone. That way he could work at his own pace without having small pieces of wood lath or old cut nails bopping him on the back of the head. The jerks thought it was cute to play with him like that. When he first started working with his older cousins, they initiated him by lifting him up and putting his feet through a window opening and closing the sash so that he had to hold himself up by hanging onto the pulls. His assailants then took off for lunch, leaving his ass cracked, exposed. When his uncle returned from the dump, Adrian was stoically still hung up there. His uncle helped him down and yelled at him for goofing off and docked him an hour's pay, as if there were any way he could have gotten into that predicament by himself. It never crossed his mind to rat out his cousins. He had passed their entrance exam with flying colors. He was sure, however, that his cousins were jealous of him because he had a white father. His mother never told him who this man was, except that he was someone very important in the neighborhood and that he had really loved her. She weighed over 300 pounds now, and it was hard for Adrian to imagine a guy ever wanted to see her naked if he didn't have to, like he did. Ick. Anyway, he had grown accustomed to the cousins' harassment. They were as much a part of the job as working from a stepladder with a missing step, or always slipping a little on constantly eroding mounds of debris. They'd worked on this job for only 4 days, and the Wednesday deadline didn't look promising. None of them trusted the white contractor, Jeff Flannery, who his uncle called Doc. He drove a junker 3-doored Saab 900, which he called his Swedish pickup. He wore threadbare Brooks Brothers white shirts and knit ties over pressed blue jeans to the job site and seemed scattered and confused most of the time. Adrian had no idea why Doc had named the company Deconstruction to Restoration, although he was sure that the deconstruction part was somehow about him. The main problem was that Adrian's uncle absolutely refused to work on the Sabbath. This left them with 1 fewer day to get the job done, and on this particular Saturday, as soon as the uncle headed out with the ridiculous overloaded truck for the last dump run, the cousins went to the barbecue and came back with 2 six-packs. The old fart'll never know. The beer was gone by 4 o'clock, and the cousins, a few minutes later, leaving Adrian alone to knock the rest of the 100-year-old plaster and wood lath from the walls of the second floor's front room and bag it. He vowed to work until there was no more light and didn't even notice when the sun had set. In due time, he realized that he was working by the light of the street lamp right outside the window, but he couldn't even begin to think about stopping. There was just too much left to do. Another hour passed. Demo guys, especially black ones, don't get temporary electricity, and his boombox's batteries were making the tape drag, so he had turned it off a while ago. As he started gathering up the tools to hide them for the night, he flipped the toggle switch to FM just as Lionel Richie began to sing. Ballerina girl, you are so lovely, with you standing there. At that moment, Adrian looked up as the lights came on the second floor of the renovated Victorian house directly across the street. What caught Adrian's eye was a long, dark oak ballet bar with bright brass fittings mounted along the back wall of the otherwise bare room, broken into thirds by the three large front windows. It wasn't sure what it was or what it was used for, but the oak and brass were beautiful just the way they were. As a girl entered the room, Adrian quickly stepped out of the light into the shadows made by the street lamp. He held his breath. They were no more than 100 feet apart on a direct line of sight. She was dressed in a t-shirt with Mick Jagger's lolling red tongue on it over fashionably torn jeans. She looked quickly out at the dark, gutted house across the street. Raising the central window sash a little higher, she stepped back a few steps and unzipped her jeans, wriggling out of them with some effort, then pulled her t-shirt over her head, revealing the shock of pubescent breasts. She raised her arms to begin tying her long blonde hair back with a blue ribbon. Instinctively, he covered his eyes with his hands. When he lowered them, his face had the added mask of a raccoon. His eyes worked hard to refocus on her now turned back. At first, Adrian thought she was naked from the waist down as well. Perspiration broke out across his forehead. He exhaled, relieved, when he caught sight of the delicate touches of salmon-colored lace at her thighs. It was better that way, he thought. Sort of. Next, she opened the purple bag and took out a pair of lime green tights. She gathered one leg at a time, into which she inserted a pointed toe and pulled them up, giving a final snap at the top of her thin waist. The whole sequence couldn't have taken more than 30 seconds, but to Adrian it lasted a deliciously long time. Certain that she could hear, he tried to quiet his pounding heart, even as the radio continued to play. She raised the sash of the middle window about a foot more, then bent down to wind the blue ribbons of her slippers around her ankles. She vanished from sight. When he saw her again, he couldn't make out the faint sound. He could make out the faint sound of a piano. She glided to the brass bar and effortlessly picked up her leg, placed it on the bar, and gradually, slowly, slid it forward until her head was resting on her knee. He had, of course, seen ballet dancers on television, but never this. Her repetitions were as perfect to him as if they were on an endlessly looping film. Her music had just stopped, and its sudden quiet snapped Adrian to attention. The vision in lime green was now fading, closing the middle window. Adrian prayed that she would go through a reverse process of undress and dress. He was disappointed when instead she threw a towel over her shoulders, gathered up her things, and pranced on the balls of her feet towards the door like a real ballerina disappearing into the wings. "No," he whispered urgently as she turned off the lights. He stared at the dark window for more than a couple of minutes, then brushed off the seat of his overalls and looked down at his dirty hands. This is no dream, he thought. Here was a vision of my mate, and tomorrow we will meet. The stairs in this building had no more rail. Treacherous with spilled wooden lath and debris, the steps now became a surfing challenge to the smiling Adrian. He secured the back door with a 16-penny nail and exited along the break between the row houses. He could not help but give a quick glance up at the window to see if she had returned, but was interrupted by a police cruiser's slowing down to keep pace with him. It accompanied him for about half a block. When he turned to stare it down, one of the cops pointed to the dust mask still perched like a clown's dunce cap on the top of his head. They laughed. The car sped up and turned the corner in the opposite direction from his street. Adrian was too happy, however, even to give them the finger. The Lionel Richie song kept playing in his head as if tattooed on his brain. You make me feel like there's nothing I can do, and when I hold you, I only want to say, I love you. Ballerina girl, the joy you bring me, every day and night, holding you tight, how I've waited for your love. Part 2. The plastic black cat's face hanging on the kitchen wall said 10:35 when Adrian finally got home. He poked his fingers a couple of times, trying to spear the clock's swishing tail. Impulsively, he pressed his fisted hands together hard against the wall and left a nearly perfect black smudged heart. He thought of his ballerina girl. He was a little lonely and wished his mother was home so he could ask her once more about his father. She worked behind the counter of the Wilsons' world-famous ribs, and she wouldn't be home before midnight on a Saturday. She was always working or getting ready to go to work or collapsing on her bed from work. Just like all the other times, he doubted that she'd tell him tonight what she'd avoided telling him for his whole life. It was strange to be 15 years old and not know who your father was, what he looked like, what he did for a living. In response to Adrian's protests, she'd just hug him and tell him that he was so precious to her that she couldn't imagine sharing him with anyone. His cousins called him Snowball, supposedly after the artificially colored coconut cake treats he had for breakfast every morning, but he knew it was really because half of him was white. The cousins' derision never hurt him and in fact marked him as being apart from them. He felt superior in a way. They would never feel what it felt like to be anything but black. He had dreams that his white father would come for him in the middle of the night and carry him asleep to his house with the freezer full of ice cream, and he would wake up there. Adrian decided the next day to hang out at Moe's Grab and Go for as long as he could just to get another look at her. Standing in front of the magazine rack, he had a clear view of Ballerina Girl's house and appeared to be deciding between the New York Times and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. The latter featured a garishly colored photo of Jack Ham smacking an Oakland Raider into the Stone Age, in contrast to the Times' small black and white of Jimmy Carter looking as if he were gripped by a bowel movement. Looking up, he caught sight of an orange Volvo station wagon pulling away from the curb. Inside was the profile of the ballerina girl sitting between her twin sisters, strapped into their car seats. The parents in front stared straight ahead. Adrian thought they all looked miserable. He had to come up with a plan to meet her. He sat on the store's steps for over an hour, reading with interest the New York Times that Moe had made him buy when the orange Volvo returned. They didn't park it. Instead, Ballerina Girl jumped out and ran into the house. The car drove on. Now or never. There was no doorbell. Instead, Adrian was faced with a flat brass 2-inch tab that had the word ring carved out of the back plate over a curved arrow that pointed in a clockwise direction. He turned it. Bring! A small dog yipped from somewhere deep in the house. A full minute later, he heard thumps that sounded like a bowling ball bouncing down a long flight of carpeted stairs. Yes, who is it? Came from the direction of the metal mail slot. Bending over slightly to direct his voice to the mail slot, he began his speech. Good morning, ma'am. My name is Leonard McElroy. I've come by today to bring you the hope of everlasting salvation. Not interested. We're Episcopalian. Besides, I can't open the door. No key. Well, how about some magazines then? He sputtered and began to panic. Ha! Is this some kind of a joke? Jed, is that you? Back up so I can see. The brass cover of the mail slot almost hit him in the face as it flipped open. Their mouths couldn't have been more than 3 inches apart. She was wearing lip gloss. Adrian could smell her perfume. His face burned as hotly as the night before. He had prepared either approach depending on the reception he got, his urban missionary spiel or working his way through college by selling magazines. Only an idiot would use both of them, one right after the other. He most certainly didn't want to show her what an idiot looked like. What she did see through the mail slot was the back of his brown sports coat as he fled up the street. Late the next morning, Adrian was mounted on the more solid of the 8-foot step ladders, taking down the bricks from a chimney. Adrian noted the black soot on the inside of the bricks. They had already pulled out the hot water heater that had stood in the middle of the downstairs parlor. It had served the first floor of the house in its rooming house days. Adrian set it against the fireplace for salvage. It would bring around $20 at Warhola's. It was a relatively easy job to remove the bricks one at a time. The mortar had long since turned to sand. He was totally lost in the mechanics of moving brick by brick, course by course, when he heard his uncle yell from upstairs. "Who's that banging on the door? Adrian, you there? See what it is." Sure enough, he yelled back as he descended the ladder. The front door had been nailed shut from the outside. So again, Adrian had to go out through the back and around the side of the house. What he saw made him lightheaded. "Hi, I'm April Hollister from across the street." It was the ballerina girl. "And my dad wants to know if you hauled trash." He could feel his cheeks burning. "You do work here, don't you?" she asked, as if she were speaking to a deaf person or a small child. She made a circle on the sidewalk with the toe of her tennis shoe. It had pink laces. "Here's our phone number. Will you give it to someone for me? You can reach my dad here almost every night." She trailed the last few words over her shoulder while dashing between their hauling truck and another car to get across the street. Her blonde hair danced into the house after her. Adrian stared at the door long after it had closed. She was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. He finally looked down at the slip of notepaper in his hand. On the top of the sheet was April. The I was dotted with a flower. The paper said Hollister Smith's 322-7839 on the first line and need trash hauled on the second. Adrian wouldn't have traded this scrap of paper for $100 bill. This was the sign he was waiting for. That night, he called the number from Moe's payphone. He made it a rule never to make important phone calls from his house phone. His mother was way too nosy. After 3 winks, a little girl answered. "Hollister Smith resident." He hung up immediately. It took approximately 10 minutes to work his courage back up. He dialed the number again. He was about to hang up once more when a man answered. "Hello? May I please speak with April, please?" He managed to hear himself say. Did I really say please twice? What an ass. Whom shall I say is calling? Adrian took a deep breath. He was nervous, but he knew she had put her phone number into his hands because he was meant to call her. Wayne Arnold, sir." He spoke in a lower register. "I'm in school with April at HSPA." He paused. He had noticed a bumper sticker on their Volvo for the High School for the Performing Arts and had hoped against hope that his simple deduction had been correct. Coincidentally, he had an older girl cousin who had gone there for singing and then went off somewhere else to study. He thought he remembered enough about what she had told him to fake it. He was a budding graphic artist himself, after all, and he knew from his cousin that the various artists didn't mix much at the school. "Oh, one moment, Wayne, I'll get her for you." Her father placed the receiver on the table. Adrian listened closely. He felt like a spy, listening to the background sounds in the room. He heard classical music coming from one direction and a little girl's voice singing a Sesame Street song about the letter B from another. "Hello? April? Hello, this is Wayne. Wayne Arnold. I don't know if you remember me, but Wayne, do I know you? Well, no, not really. I mean, yes, sort of. I mean, we both know Bill. Bill? Bill Pratt? Yeah, that's right. Bill Pratt. Adrian was relieved. He was out of control. 10 minutes later, when he had hung up the phone, he couldn't believe that she had actually wanted to meet him at the zoo's aquarium the following Saturday afternoon. Somehow the thought of spending an entire afternoon babysitting her 4-year-old twin sisters had given her the courage to suggest the rendezvous. When the day arrived, April's dad dropped his daughters off at the front gate of the zoo. Do you need any more money, sweetheart? No, Dad, we're fine. April told the twins to hold hands. She herded them toward the admissions gate, glancing back to make sure her dad had driven away before she turned in the direction of the benches just in front of the newly renovated aquarium exhibition. She was disappointed. The only people she saw were an elderly couple, a pregnant woman with a toddler, and a nervous-looking young black guy. He looked up at her and smiled. April? She obviously didn't recognize Adrian from their first meeting. She had been super polite, but he could tell from that first look at him that she was repulsed. It was clear that Wayne wouldn't have to carry his masquerade on for very long. Adrian had gotten the message. The entire date lasted about 15 minutes, with April nearly pulling her little sisters past the Antarctica scenery of the penguin area and the dozens of tanks of exotically arrayed fish. Her excuse that she had forgotten that the girls had to get back home early for a schoolmate's birthday party was transparently a lie. She shook his hand when they reached the exit to the aquarium and said that she'd keep an eye out for him back at good old HSPA. He was certain that she only was treating him this way because he wasn't white enough. It made him crazy, and then crazier as the days went by. All I remembered from the date was that shocked look in her eyes when he had called her name. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. He understood his cousins now better than he ever had before. And the longer he thought about it, the crazier he became. 3. 2 months had passed. On this particular Sunday, again in front of Moe's Grab and Go, he was wearing an army camouflage jacket. He had a black do-rag wrapped over his curls. His eyes stared unfocused at the Volvo wagon he was to call his waiting cousins as soon as it had pulled away from the curb. The plan was to meet in the alley behind April's house with the beat-up Dodge van they had stolen the night before. Adrian felt nothing. If all went according to plans, in 30 minutes they'd be pulling out of the alley with a van full of loot. The cousins were to wear ski masks, kick in the back door, ransack the house in less than 30 minutes and bring whatever they could to the back fence as quickly as possible and hand it over the fence piece by piece for him to load into the van. Jump back over the fence themselves, get back in the van and get the hell out of there slowly and carefully so that they wouldn't attract any attention. They already had a vacant house lined up a few blocks away to store the stuff in and would dump the van behind a little league field in the suburbs. Getting over was more important than getting something for his cousins. Revenge is sweet. The breaking and entering existed in their minds as just other kinds of practical jokes. They had never actually hurt anyone. Carrying a gun was like carrying your wallet. His uncle didn't want to know about the piece, but everyone else in the family knew they had at least one. No one spoke about it. Adrian was so distracted that he almost missed the orange Volvo driving by. He balanced the quarter on the lip of the payphone slot for an extra second. When he heard it drop, he felt it hit the pit of his stomach. He tasted metal. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he looked at his watch. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but what was taking them so damn long? They had pulled the truck so far into the parking area between the fence and the alley that all they had to do was open the back doors, step up on the floor of the van, and vault into the raised flower beds. He watched from the rearview mirror as they sprang over. He was glad he'd stayed behind. The cousin's pry bar popped the expensive lock in seconds. Adrian barely heard the door bang open, but that was a long time ago. There had been no noise from the house since. He was beginning to get agitated. His cousins treated him with more respect today. Their usual stream of put-downs was gone. As a matter of fact, only 3 words had passed between them from the time he had met them in the van behind the house until they disappeared over the fence. Let's do it. And now they were doing it. Just then he thought he heard a crack. He wanted it to have been an M80, but he had heard that sound before, too often, too late at night. He shut his eyes and saw her once more dancing. He saw her naked breasts. His eyes flooded with tears as he bolted from the driver's seat. This was all wrong. He pushed off with his left foot, high jumped over the fence, rolled himself upright, and ran across the brick courtyard. He burst into the kitchen. He could smell the loaves of bread cooling on the black iron stove. Adrian stopped short at the threshold of the front hallway. He noticed the bowling alley shine on the pine floors and some fresh scrapes about 2 feet apart across them. He almost tripped over the pile, blocking his path. 4 speaker boxes, 2 TVs, a mahogany silverware chest, and 4 packs of Heineken. Speaker wires seemed to stick out everywhere. There was broken glass all over the floor. The words, "Get the fuck out of our hood," had been spray painted on the wallpapered wall. He could just make out voices coming down the front staircase. Otherwise, the house was as silent as a tomb. A step creaked. He stopped and proceeded up the stairs more carefully. Instinct warned him to stay quiet, that he needed to exercise caution. Halfway up the stairs, he could begin making out what the voices were saying. "Why don't we just off her?" "Shit, man, the hard part's done. Let's just get this stuff and get the hell out of here. The little bitch is so scared she can't see straight. For Christ's sake, put your mask back on. What's the matter with you? Don't you ever put your fucking hands on me again. I don't care who the fuck you are." They didn't sound like his cousins anymore. They were robbers, certainly, rapists, possibly, in his girlfriend's house, and he was afraid of them. Adrian could have been the one gagged and tied to the cast iron French parlor stove on the 3rd floor, but he was the one who could still save her. He tiptoed back down the stairs while the cousins continued their argument. Victorian paper dresses and cardboard dolls were scattered across the parlor floor. He crept on down the hall toward the inner doors of the vestibule. He almost slipped on a small pool of blood. In the corner of the wall lay April's little terrier, shot in the head. Shit, he said under his breath. He turned the key on the deadbolt to the front doors. The clank sounded like an explosion. He was afraid to make any more noise by opening the door. He looked back at the antique coat stand. There was a yellow raincoat with a bright red lining, an overlarge trench coat, and 3 identical yellow plastic stickers in various sizes that made him think of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. Goldilocks had had no fear. He slid one arm into the trench coat, his fingertips just showing beyond the sleeve, then the other. He turned up the collar and buttoned the coat. He then took down the gray Edwardian fedora and pulled it over his face and looked at himself in the mirror. He blew out his cheeks and pulled the front door open with alacrity. He slammed it shut. "April, we're home," he shouted into the front hall in his best white Big Bear voice. The silence that followed gave his stomach a turn. He waited a beat, too. "April, are you home?" The dog, of course, was still lying stuffed in the corner. Anyone coming in that door could have seen it. "April, what in God's name has happened to Ginger?" Still nothing. He was desperate to hear running footsteps on the back stairs. Silence. They were calling his bluff. He would have to raise the stakes. His instinct was to stomp his feet in place, making as much noise as possible. But the dice had been thrown. In for a dime, in for $1. Sweet Jesus. He picked out the largest of the umbrellas in the faux sawed-off elephant's foot and raised it like a sword. Halfway up, he heard running steps going down the back stairs and out through the kitchen. He could just make out his name being shouted and the truck screeching off down the alley. He took a deep breath and proceeded slowly up the front stairs. He shut his eyes for a second and imagined April's relief at seeing him. When he reached the top, a flash, no sound, then a release from all his cares.